Welcome to the second annual Five Towns, One Book event. My name is Nicole Alifanti, and I'm one of the founders and the president of CURE, the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. Before we get started, I have to thank many awesome people and organizations. So we want to thank the Westchester Board of Legislators, especially Catherine Parker, who is a fan of our work and has been consistently supporting us. This year we partnered with LMC Media, so this is being brought to you by LMC, the Westchester Library System, and the Human Rights Commission of Westchester. We're really grateful to be working with these five libraries, Rye, Harrison, Rochelle, Larchmont, and Mamaroneck. And today we are at Harrison Library, and we want to thank Galina Chernick, the librarian here, who's been so incredible. Thanks, Galina. We have 20 additional libraries throughout the county that joined us this year, amplifying this event, but also bringing some of Heather McGee's work through the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Project. So some of the libraries have looked at their toolkit and some of the resources they have, and they're using them in their libraries. So it's been a really exciting expansion of this project for us. So tonight today, this beautiful sunny day. Thanks for being here, everybody. We are highlighting chapter 10, which is the solidarity dividend in Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us. And she simply explains it as where Americans are reaching across racial lines, working together for the common good and securing better lives for us all. I just want to say, for those who haven't read the book, through much of the book, she shines a light on what she calls the zero-sum game. So Miss McGee writes, and these are her words, many white Americans view race as a zero-sum game. There is an us and a them, and what's good for them is bad for us. This rationale animates our public policies even today, when those who benefit from our country's drastic economic inequality sell the zero-sum story to block public support for any collective action that benefits us all, from universal health care to living wages. So we're so honored to have these four panelists here today. They are living the solidarity dividend. They're working across intersectional groups. Be good, kids. They're giggling already. They're working across intersectional groups to create an equitable, anti-racist Westchester. So if you're reading this book and thinking, where are the examples of this happening? Well, we have some examples here today. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves because I wouldn't do the service. Your bodies of work are so prolific. So please tell us your names and the organizations you work with. I think we'll go alphabetical order. So that brings us to Reverend Joya.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, we're good. It's so good to be with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I know you're in great hands. I certainly want to thank Nicole and CURE for hosting, and also thank my fellow esteemed panelists. It's nice to be here alongside you, even virtually. So again, my name is Reverend Joya Colon-Berezin, and I serve as the Minister of Christian Education at the Scarsdale Congregational Church in Scarsdale in Westchester, right nearby. We are affiliated with the United Church of Christ. If you are not familiar with the UCC, now's as good a time as any to get to know them. And my work and passion has often been at the intersection of faith and social justice, first as a community organizer working with churches and other faith institutions, and then in the field of faith-based global humanitarian aid work. I worked with Church World Service, if anyone knows the work of Church World Service. And now I work, of course, in a congregational setting where I help lead our racial justice group and other social justice ministries, including the work of the Poor People's Campaign, which is what I'm really here today to talk about, which is exciting. The Poor People's Campaign is a continuation of the movement that Martin Luther King Jr. and many others launched in 1968, just a few short months before he was killed. And this current resurgence of the campaign began in 2018, a 50-year commemoration. So I'll talk later on more about what the Poor People's Campaign is. But the one thing I do want to say now is that the campaign identifies as a moral revival movement, which means that it is rooted in the ethical teachings of my faith, Christianity, as well as many other religious traditions, and also rooted in non-religious or secular teachings that advocate speaking truth to power and building a more just society for all. So I'm super glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Joya. I think, Theresa, you're next in alphabetical order.
Okay, well, amen to what the Reverend said, because that sounded a little bit like a sermon, and that speaks to my heart. So my name is Theresa, and I am the Community Service Coordinator for Washingtonville Housing Alliance that's located in Mamaroneck. I come from a history of psychiatric nursing for almost 20 years here in Westchester County. I've done some community organizing and outreach in Yonkers for a number of years as well. And I am a native New Yorker, born and raised in the Bronx, moved to Westchester in the 70s. And I come to this conversation through the lens of an African American who has spent way more decades than I want to admit to living the experience. So thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Mr. Yellin?
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Yellin. I'd like to start my remarks by doing a very brief land acknowledgement to the Lenape-Hoking folks whose territory we are, or I'll speak for myself. I'm an uninvited occupant today of their territory, so I'd like to recognize that. I'd also like to thank CURE, obviously, and the Westchester Library System, true defenders of our First Amendment, and librarians. Really shout out to you librarians, much appreciated for your work. I'm a longtime New Rochelle resident. My background is doing union work. I'm a trade unionist, if you will. Today, I'm going to participate as a member of several organizations, and I'm going to read what these organizations are, because I've learned in this work of addressing race and racism, words are very important. So I want to make sure my words are right, and words are important, but actions are even more important. So we hear a lot of people say a lot of really good things, and it's very important for us to be able to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So I'm a member of New Rochelle Against Racism, New Roar. It's a community-based, multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multiracial organization that formed in 2014. And fortunately, we have some of our New Roar folks in the room, so I feel real comfortable. We're committed to building and promoting a collective understanding of structural and institutional racism, and developing meaningful dialogues about race in the country, and especially in where we reside, which is New Rochelle. I also co-chair a New Rochelle Alliance for Justice, otherwise known as Enrage. And if you're not enraged about what's going on in New Rochelle, I'll speak about New Rochelle and the world in general, then you're kind of missing the point of what's going on around you. So Enrage was initiated by New Roar. It's an alliance of faith, community, and labor organizations, so the Reverend knows about us. We advocate for equitable power sharing, economic and environmental justice, responsible development, affordable housing, good jobs, and careers for New Rochelle residents, and the advancement of civil and human rights in New Rochelle. And lastly, I'm a longtime resident of the Glenwood Lake neighborhood. So I'm a longtime member of the Glenwood Lake Association in New Rochelle, which has an almost 70-year history of working for essentially black and white togetherness, if you will. But essentially home ownership and Black empowerment is part of that. And I feel fortunate to have been able to reside there for a number of years and be supported by my neighbors. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tasha Young. And first, I also would like to thank Nicole and the library system and everyone who is instrumental in organizing this talk. And thank you, Michael, for bringing in the fact that we are on unceded land. My name is Tasha. I've lived most of my life in Greenberg, and I have worked with several people in this room on reform and progressive initiatives, particularly around racial equity. So in Greenberg right now, we have a number of initiatives that are pushing policy. I do also teach at NYU at the School of Social Work, Policy, Social Action, and Legislation and Advocacy. So I'm here as someone who really appreciates making change and good trouble, and creating policy that creates some of that power sharing that Michael was talking about. So it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. So we have a little under an hour. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to try our best to tackle a little bit of this chapter. I want to just start by setting the scene again for folks who haven't read the book. Heather McGhee opens chapter 10 discussing Lewiston, Maine, and how it was pretty much a town that had been broken after the mills closed, and there were several thousand people addicted to opioids. And there was a revitalization because there was a sort of a diaspora of African immigrants who came in. And over time, they built a movement of 32,000 people, coined the Maine's People's Alliance. And so, you know, in our conversation preparing for this panel, we were kind of like looking at that scenario and thinking about how incredible it was and saying, you know, what does that look like in Westchester? This is a pretty well-resourced county. Is it possible to build an alliance across racial and socioeconomic boundaries toward a more equitable county? And looking at, racism in our institutions, is that possible to do that in a place like this that isn't so destitute and isn't, struggling? There are parts of it that definitely are. And I think, one of the unique things about this Maine Alliance was that, it was really led by the immigrants that came in. And there was even a point that I really find interesting about this is there was even the Mainers who had been there for generations, the Franco-Americans, were finding their language again in these African immigrants who came over and relearning French. And so there were so many reasons to bond together as a community. And so, I guess, my question is, I guess we'll just start with, where are you in your organizations, and where is stuff like this happening in the places that you're involved in, the spaces that you're involved in? Are you working in a non-hierarchical organization, in an anti-racist organization? Are you being led by, folks who generally voices we don't listen to? So do you want to start with a little bit more about the Poor People's Campaign, Joya?
Sure, and I'll start a little more broadly, and then get specific. Hopefully I won't take too much time. So I think that Heather McGhee's emphasis on the politics of solidarity is super important. This notion that our collective good, or the sum of us, should really be our guiding light. That should be our priority. And that is right in line with the Poor People's Campaign. As Martin Luther King was nearing the end of his life as a moral leader, his focus began to really hone in on human rights. And he became pretty clear about two things: the problem and the solution. And he named the problems that America was facing as the result of what he called triplet evils: racism, poverty, and militarism. This week, we have certainly seen the evil of militarism come to light in really horrifying ways. But anyway, so the new Poor People's Campaign has actually added more evils or injustices: ecological devastation, denial of healthcare. We could probably go on and on for a while. So this is the problem, and these evils or injustices are interlocking. That's what he said. And the solution is a social movement that would uplift the voices of poor and low-income people with a new vision and ultimately end poverty. So in 1968, he calls for a revolution of values in America, and they try to launch this broad social movement that can unite poor people across race, gender, sexual orientation, and for it to be a national movement. And it was called the Poor People's Campaign. So we call this movement a fusion movement because of these interlocking injustices, but we also call it a moral movement because it's about right and wrong. And it seeks to name and to challenge the kind of dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is that poverty is a result of individual choices or bad choices. I think this is something Heather McGhee talks a lot about. And instead, she reframes it as a systemic issue, which is what the Poor People's Campaign does as well. So we try to change the narrative by changing the narrator, by lifting up stories of people that are living the struggle, confronted by the struggle on an everyday, so we can overturn this myth of what poverty is. Poverty is a systemic issue perpetrated by a system of oppression. So the Poor People's Campaign centers voices of poor and low-income people, not politicians, not people that already have a platform or power. And there's kind of a slogan in the Poor People's Campaign: poor people can think for themselves, speak for ourselves, fight for ourselves, and lead for ourselves. And we seek to influence public policy by building power through this kind of activism and participation. So for example, on June 12th, 2018, there was a group that went to DC and spoke to Congress and told their personal stories. And on an ongoing basis, the Poor People's Campaign engages in direct action across the country to raise awareness about poverty and these interlocking evils. And the structure really happens at a grassroots level. So there are statewide organizations. So like New York State has its own organization. That's what I'm a part of. And then they cover about 40 states across the country. And they have all sorts of committees like arts and culture, media, political education, and then regional committees. So that's what I'm part of here in Hudson Valley. And right now here, we're focused on healthcare and housing. But I'll pause here because I think hopefully I've answered your question, and I could talk more about the healthcare and housing later on.
The big H's, healthcare and housing. That narrative is really important. And I want to go to you, Theresa. I keep, doing the alphabetical loop. Sorry, I don't know how else to do it. But the narrative is important about why people are poor, right? And so you and I, you work in Mamaroneck. I live in Larchmont, Mamaroneck. And we saw after the hurricane, the flood, Ida, and during COVID as well, an incredible support in our communities for folks who were vulnerable. We saw people feeding people and donating tons of money to, getting people set up in alternate shelters. And it really is it's a great community in that way. You and I often talk about, though, what that jump is from charity, which is really important in a crisis, to building equity within a small community. And the narrative is so important because I think as long as we have the story that people are poor because of their own, situations and lives and the choices they make, but I'm happy to help if they're hungry, or, what is it, what is it when we start to dig into the system and understanding that, and how do we help communities understand that so we can make the jump?
Right. So I think I need to sort of preface a little bit of my role in that whole sort of experience as well. So I work for Washingtonville Housing Alliance, which is a grassroots nonprofit affordable housing organization. That's sort of a 40-year plus history of being local. We own 40 and manage 40 rental units in the Washingtonville area of Mamaroneck. And pre-COVID, we've been trying to sort of find some sites where we can sort of develop and add to the portfolio of affordable housing. And Westchester County has done the research already. You know, they have the housing needs study that was done, the United Way of Westchester, and it really identifies the housing crisis in Westchester County across all the different municipalities. So the research and the data is already there. More housing is needed. So we've been trying to, again, build our portfolio, and we've come, you know, Mamaroneck is wealthy, you know, the prices are high, we're a nonprofit, so trying to find a place that we can sort of develop has been a challenge, and that was pre-COVID. So then when COVID came, our organization, like many others, sort of had the opportunity to kind of sit back only for a moment, because the pandemic produced its own challenges that we had to sort of really pivot on and get creative on, and how do we keep our doors open to serve those who were most in need. And as we were doing that, it's sort of the gifts started to appear. So we were able to sort of join forces with other local organizations that were working locally to address the pandemic needs. All sorts of really generous people came out to sort of help with that effort. We had the Coalition for Community that was sort of formed to address that. But what was really sort of really magnified for us was the need for housing, and how the overcrowdedness and how the poor conditions in some of these homes that people were living in was sort of really making the COVID situation even more dire and more deadly for those families. And then we had the storm that had the nerve to show up last year with climate change, of course. And then there was this devastation in the community with the flooding, and people were losing everything. So between those events, and then again, having a brief opportunity to sort of sit and regroup and look at our mission, I think what we saw was really generous people who, again, like Nicole identified, really do want to help. And you don't know what you don't know until you learn differently. So I think those really tragic episodes sort of gave people an opportunity to see things a little bit differently. I think the pandemic sort of put everybody in a position for even a moment of being the most vulnerable and those who were also at risk. So that sort of collective sort of experience sort of really gave people an opportunity to see things differently. And I think that's where we are, that just throwing money at feeding people is not the answer. That really we have to really take more systemic and a long-term approach to how do we really provide housing for everybody in the community, essential workers, those working in your grocery stores who might be making $14 an hour, working full time. There's not housing available for those people in the community. So I think that's sort of been the galvanizing moment where people are starting to really, really understand the need to sort of move things in a different direction. That charity is good, but it's not going to make a long-term sort of change for people. And everybody in the community deserves, housing is the most basic need there is. I mean, this is not like rocket science. If you don't have good, adequate, as a parent, as an individual, you want to be able to live and raise your family in a place that's safe, that's respectful. So that's where we are with that. I think it's just a collective sort of opportunity now for people to start to address these issues in a way that's going to really be meaningful and impactful for the long run. And if you're afraid of that, if you're afraid of what housing for everybody looks like, come join and have a conversation. This is the work that we're doing to sort of educate and lay the fears or the stereotypes that are out there. And if after the conversations, you still don't want affordable housing for everybody, step aside. Because we're going to make sure, I think everybody's just at that point now where it's the right thing to do, like the Reverend said. Like if you're laying your head on the pillow at night comfortably, then we have a responsibility to our fellow community members to make sure everybody has that. It's just a basic human right. So
yeah,
I don't want to preach, but you know, it's just,
but
yeah.
but I also will dig deeper later into the zero sum narrative that stops that from happening, and also how it's really beneficial for everyone, right?
Absolutely.
This is right.
Right.
Some of us will actually benefit from affordable housing in every
Right.
neighborhood. So again, I feel like you keep going last, but it's not really last. Ultimately, it's a circle. So, okay, well, do you want to step in before this gentleman does? Please.
I really didn't mind, but since now I have the opportunity, so just repeat the question so I make sure I'm on.
So right now in the organizations you're working with, you know, where are you seeing this sort of, because you said, let me look at my notes. It's amazing how big my notes are, and they're so disorienting. But when we were talking, you had the greatest expression that you called it the global majority, right? So you were talking about working across racial lines and what we would call people of color, and sometimes in certain contexts, marginalized folks, right? You're calling the global majority. And I think that might trigger some white people. Yes. Like, what does that mean? You know, I thought the whole world was about me. But, you know, so I want to step into like, where are you working? How did you come up with that phrase? What are you seeing across racial lines in your work?
Thank you. So the most pressing work I'm doing is both with the White Plains Greenburgh NAACP, and we've done a number of initiatives. We picked up on a sign. So where the Welcome to Greenburgh signs are, we were able to get a sign put up that says, all lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter. And the day we put it up, it was removed violently. And it took just short of a year for the board to put the sign back up. But let's not villainize the board. They had gotten threats, you know, from people in the community that did not want it to be put up. So through the work of the NAACP, we not only, and many other activists, Westchester Black Women's Political Caucus and individuals. So the sign is back up. And then the NAACP went even further and got a Black Lives Matter resolution passed. And that gives us an entry into policymaking. So, you know, when we talk about affordable housing or economic development, which is an area I'm really trying to work very hard in, because after this pandemic, and we went through a couple. We went through the racial reckoning pandemic. We went through the health crisis and also an economic downturn to boot. But government did act and allotted a lot of funding for these initiatives that we're trying to follow up on. So when you talk about affordable housing, and I know the study that you're referring to is a good study. I think we need about 11,000 more units. Close, thank you. Close to more than that. And even it is, right?
That's what they documented, but we know it's more.
It's more. And the reason we need it in this county is because we can't sustain our own economy. So back to the zero sum and back to when you look at policy from a diversity initiative, from bringing as many in to the equation. That is that's almost the opposite of how Westchester operates. We in Greenburgh, I'm experiencing in many communities, appreciate the exclusivity, appreciate school districts with very low amount of enrollment, right? That's what makes us whatever it is that we want to be. So to me, yes, it's systemic, of course, but I see racism in 4 different pockets. And I see racial equity work in those 4 pockets. So I start with the individual, right? We are conditioned to certain beliefs about one another, who belongs where, who can be free and thrive and who cannot, who, needs to do the work on their own and who is just so gifted by the gene pool that, they just know how to do it and you don't. That's in us. That's in all of us. So this is not even to target one race, separate from another. That's in all races. Right? We have to deal with that. Then it's like, how do we deal with one another? And then we get into the institutions that we're all a part of. then we get into the structures that we all run up against. So for housing, from the policy standpoint, you have to start with HUD and how they do their formulas, which they do update from time to time. I think the latest update was maybe 2010. We know the whole world has changed in 2 years, much less 12 years. So we have to think about, are these formulas actually creating affordable housing? With the salaries in Westchester, it's arguable that the housing under these guidelines is affordable or not, number one. So, and I could go on and on in policy, forgive me, I'm a bit of a geek about policy, but the data proves that we have to look at how the overall system of housing is happening to us. So what can we do locally is, like Heather has said in the book, really follow leadership of color and leadership that is in the incomes that need access to housing, not the incomes that have access to housing. If we bring them into the discussion, they will tell us how to create good policy. But unless we address how we feel about those people, we're not going to follow them. We're not going to listen to them. So like conversations like this kind of help us kind of see where we're at in the spectrum, I think. So I hope that helps open it into a bit of how I think to approach this.
No, absolutely. And I think, the solidarity dividend in her book, it's really hopeful. She points to Maine, and then she talks about the truth and healing. But when we talked the first time, we realized it was more complicated, right? That these groups are coming together, and that's really hopeful. But within that, there's a lot to peel back. There is how we feel about each other. There's policy. It's an onion, and we have to want to do it. And I think we have to convince white people that there's something in it for them, and there is, right? Go ahead, my friend. I'm sorry.
That's good. Well, I really appreciate where Tasha and Theresa ended up with their, if you want to call it an answer to that question, which is basically conversations amongst people who don't look like you or us. And with Rochelle Against Racism, that's really where it started. We came together. We'll be going into our 9th year around reading a book called Mass Incarceration, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And here we are almost 9 years later. People come, people go. We meet every week. So the real hard work, if you will, is to have those conversations. Talk to Black folks talk to white folks, talk to other people who don't look like you or me or us, and begin to have those conversations to break down the barriers that have been created between us, which are totally unnatural. We're all human beings. We all come from the same place, ultimately. So the divisions that are fed by those who want to make sure that they can continue to control us, if you will, are really not real at all. Right. So it begins with conversation. So that's what Rochelle Against Racism started with. And we've continued those conversations, which are very difficult. And then within those conversations, certain things come up about how do we address structural and institutional racism in the community in which we live. So we talk about and act as best we can on such things as housing, employment, any area that's institutionally, I'll say repressing Black people in particular, but obviously, folks of color, all people of color, and poor white people as well. And that's where the sum of us comes in. It's like, we're in this together, and everybody benefits when Black people benefit. If we can all get together, everybody will benefit. So I want to just mention 2 things that we have worked on at Rochelle Against Racism. And none of this work is easy work at all for anybody. right? So there was unfortunately a police killing in New Rochelle of a young man named Kamal Flowers, an African-American young man, on June 5th of 2020. On June 3rd of 2020, there was the largest demonstration that I can recall in New Rochelle. It was a Black Lives Matter demonstration in New Rochelle. It was a march and rally. I won't call it a demonstration. It was a march and rally, totally peaceful, led by young African-American New Rochelle residents on June 3rd. It was very positive, a lot of white folks there. Our elected leaders were there. And 2 days later, Alec McKenna, police officer Alec McKenna, murdered Kamal Flowers. Alec McKenna actually later in the year received some commendation from the New Rochelle Police Department, not for murdering Mr. Flowers, but for other things presumably that he had done, because I do not want to presume, I don't want to even say that the New Rochelle Police Department supported this. Absolutely not. Police officers do not go out to kill people. They're here to protect us all. But it did happen. So we, New Rochelle Against Racism, worked with particularly the Black community, but other folks who were interested to raise this issue up. The NAACP was very central to it. And shortly thereafter, folks recall, but maybe not too shortly, but former Governor Cuomo signed an executive order for every city and municipality in the state of New York to undergo this internal review of police practices. And New Rochelle did that as well and is doing that. And what New Roar brought to the table was the idea of a civilian complaint review board, where you have an independent review board made up of appointed citizens who have the power to actually do something to address police violence. And so that's one area that I wanted to lift up that New Roar has been involved with. And that helps everybody in our community, because if the police are supported by the community, by everybody, then everybody is safer in that community. So that's Black people, white people, brown people, whomever. The other area that we recently got very active was around environmental racism. And the city of New Rochelle, June of last year, declared an environmental emergency. All hands on deck. We have to protect our community from global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it. This was post-Ida. And actually, this was before Ida. They declared an environmental emergency. And then 1 month later, the city council approved a Starbucks drive-through immediately adjacent to public housing, which is predominantly, residents are predominantly African-American, and supportive housing, which is mostly young women with children who need housing. So you have a drive-through approved by the city of New Rochelle. They had to rezone this property to allow for this drive-through. They're not allowed anywhere else in the residential zone. And the city of New Rochelle, they rezoned it, and the planning board approved it. So one of our leaders within New Roar, if you want to call it a leader, an African-American woman, she organized an environmental racism trolley tour. We hired a trolley to take us around the city of New Rochelle to point out areas where environmental racism has been inflicted upon and experienced by Black people in particular. And that was the first annual environmental racism tour in New Rochelle. And we will do more, and be hopeful that at some point the city will understand the implications of the decisions that they make and how they affect Black people in particular, and around the Starbucks specifically. So I hope that helped answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all that good work is done by, like you said, a very diverse group, both socioeconomically, age, race,
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And New Rochelle Against Racism was actually my inspiration for starting this group, because I didn't know anything about our history. I didn't have time that's a really bad way of saying it, not time. I didn't have the experiences of listening to people of color in my life, even though I grew up in very diverse spaces. And that's what I did for several years. And that was really changed my life. So Joya, go back and talk about, you wanted to dig a little deeper in with, you left off on housing and healthcare. Thank you. The two H's.
Yeah, sure. Also, I just like, as some of you were talking, particularly you, Tasha, like I was thinking, you know, so the mission of the Poor People's Campaign is to end poverty. It really has a material kind of focus. And as someone said to me recently, like, if that happened like on Wednesday, like if poverty ended on Wednesday, which would be amazing, that probably wouldn't do that much to change internalized interpersonal and cultural racism, right? That's a different type of work. So I just wanted to kind of name that. And also say that the Poor People's Campaign is not aiming to convince white people of that racism is not in their best interest. I mean, racism is not a rational thing. So there's not a rational argument that can be made to change somebody's mind to not be racist. The Poor People's Campaign is looking for people that are ready to take a stand on the things that they have in common with people of all races, which is to improve their lives and have their basic needs provided for. So I also want to name that. So in terms of those basic needs, like I mentioned, the Poor People's Campaign is right now part of these coalitions. One is the Campaign for New York Health that is trying to provide comprehensive healthcare for every New Yorker. And the other is the Housing Justice for All movement, which I'm sure you're all aware of. That's a statewide movement for, you know, to fight for housing as a human right. They've already had really several very impressive victories, but pushing for a lot more. And as you well know, a lot more needs to happen for affordable housing. The other work locally here in Westchester is on the fight to save Mount Vernon Hospital. And some of you might know more about that than I do. I'm pretty new to the fight, but we've had at least one, maybe several actions calling attention to that closure, how significant that would be for the surrounding community, and kind of shining a spotlight on the inequality there. So yeah, if anyone is interested in getting more involved with the Poor People's Campaign locally, I can put my email in the chat, or, you know, you can reach out to Nicole. Did I answer your question?
Definitely. And you, in our conversation prior to this too, also, you drew out an image from Heather's book that said that the country kind of went from like a football shape, you know, where like the middle was growing fat into like a bow tie. And you said that it kind of points a mirror on what we value, you know, in America. I mean, how have we always been like, I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Like, have we always been like this, or are we getting worse, or why are we so eager to feed people and give them a refrigerator if they need it, but not understand what would really support thriving instead of surviving? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, that's like an out of the blue. I'm sorry, I'm throwing that at you, but you're, you know, steeped in this work and you're a reverend. And so are there conversations in houses of worship about this? Are we discussing that?
You're not surprising me. That was on the list. Come on.
I pass on that question.
No. Yeah, no, I mean, so I guess just to be very clear. So my belief is that everything that's on this earth belongs to God and God and God alone. So we've been blessed with enough for all the billions of, I don't know, is it like 4 billion people, 7, however many people of us, there's enough for each of us to live with enough. It's a matter of sharing it the right way. So that's the perspective I come from. And that's really the perspective of my denomination. And I hope my congregation and people of faith, people of conscience believe similar things. And so, you know, we need ways to apply those ideas, and the Poor People's Campaign is one clear way. And then in terms of the bow tie and the football, I thought that was a really kind of frightening image or analogy that she gave about how just within the past few decades, the distribution of wealth has gone from sort of the middle class being the biggest part, and then falling down at the sides, to a bow tie, which is essentially the drastic shrinking of the middle class. And I talked a lot about King and the initial launch of the PPC. And the truth is, the frightening truth is that there are more people living in poverty today than when King launched the campaign in 1968, which is really frightening. And poverty, as we've already talked about, touches every demographic of our society. So the destruction of the middle class is a huge problem. And it's a result of wages for the people at the bottom not increasing, and basic costs of needs rising, and our economy it becoming like really, as the bow tie, like polarized. So you have this 1% at the top with this extreme concentration of wealth. And then the pandemic has only added to that. You have millions more of people falling into poverty. And I'll just read a statistic. Where is it? You have the world's 10 richest men. Their wealth more than doubled from 700 billion to 1.5 trillion over the course of the pandemic. Those statistics are frightening. The image of the bow tie is frightening. And the Poor People's Campaign seeks to intervene on some of those frightening statistics.
Thank you. So I feel like time is flying. I don't even know what time it is. I'm afraid it's like 3:30 already. But I want to have another round quickly. And Theresa, just really quickly, a little bit go back to like on the ground, what does it look like? What are some of I want to go back to housing for a second. We're talking about a median income here in Westchester. That's kind of how we figure out what affordable is. And those numbers are what, like 65 to like 85,000, somewhere in there.
Right.
So if you're right, is that like
that's not the median income.
No, I mean, that's based on a percentage of the median income. When we say affordable housing, you have to make like your income has to be like 65 to 85 or somewhere in there in order
that's for
qualified for affordable.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's even high.
Okay.
So what I really want to touch on is how we're starting to have that conversation locally in Mamaroneck and Larchmont. So we've, because of everything that happened, have sort of established this Mamaroneck Coalition for Affordable Housing. And even the name sort of brought up a little bit of a conversation on affordable housing, people are going to run. Maybe we should call it something else. And we're like, you know what, let's just start running from language also, because language does matter. But let's just be clear about what the needs are. Like everybody needs housing. So because of the glaring disparities that have been sort of revealed, we have all of these sort of local efforts going on now. All of the different faith-based houses of worship are coming together. All of the local residents are coming together. And the focus is really about, let's find out what the local officials who sit on the planning boards, who sort of make all the decisions locally, what is their position on housing? Everybody needs to know what their local, in politics, it all happens on a local level. It's not about the presidential elections that happen every 4 years. I think people are really starting to realize it's really about the local efforts. So let's talk about what are the officials, where they stand. Are they representing the real voice of the people that they're serving? And let's get everybody's voice to the table. Let's find out all of the lower income people, everybody who was impacted by the storm, everybody who's really impacted by COVID, what their voice is saying. What do they want to see? What do they need? And I think that's really been the goal for our efforts locally. Let's just come together and sort of collaborate and stand strong.
Right. And I'm sorry, my statistic, I didn't articulate myself clearly about that. I think what I'm trying to say is that we're talking about people who are social workers, firemen, police officers, teachers, essential workers, nurses, this is, and of course, and the folks who are working 2 jobs and still can't bring in over, 50,000 a year below. Like, we're talking about working people.
Right. And we're also talking about those who are aging out, who are getting older, whose families have moved away, who can't afford the taxes and the houses on their very restricted incomes now. We're talking about young people who have grown up in these communities, who are starting out as a social worker or a teacher, which a salary of even $100,000 is not enough to support a decent house in Mamaroneck and Larchmont. Like, you're working, so that if you've grown up and have roots in that community, you still can't afford to live in that community. So those are the issues. Those are the populations that we're really seeking to sort of secure a reasonable place for people to live. Like, people don't want to move from Yonkers into Mamaroneck necessarily. Like, people want to be able to live in their own communities in dignity and respect with something that they can afford.
Thanks. So would you like to speak to, actually, no, I want to go to Tasha, because I want you to end with the truth and racial. Do you want to speak more to what we're discussing here? I know, percolating.
Yeah, my mind, because I'm like, she did ask about the global majority. So I'll touch on that really quickly. I'll touch on that really quickly. So I can't remember exactly where I heard the term, but it's in, one of the anti-racist organizing circles because doing anti-racist work, let me say this. You don't check a box and say, okay, I'm an anti-racist. You have to continue to be informed. You have to continue to listen. You have to continue to call people in when there's like some kind of, mismatch with how we're thinking about the same thing. So in one of the circles I was in, they started saying that. So of course we know the term BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? So it's basically everybody can be in there outside of people who identify as what we know as whiteness or white people. So they said, persons of the global majority. So that is similar or the same as people of color. Mm-hmm. And the reason I frame it that way is because we do need to just teach the truth, right? To borrow from the work that you all are doing and just call it what it is. But this is not a new concept. I mean, people of color have always been the global majority. And we've been on this planet for tens of thousands of years. So this construct of racism is maybe, 600 years old? So we don't have to operate like this. So when we say global majority, it's just really telling the truth. And I like what she says that, Black people are not, or people, I'll speak for myself as a Black person, I do not obsess about ways to disenfranchise white people. That never, ever comes up in any of the homogenous groups that I'm in. What we are trying to do is lessen the barriers to be able to experience the quality of life that white people do. That's what we really want. So if white people are thinking in that zero sum, like, we've colonized, so they want to colonize us, and it's like, no, we really don't. We don't even really think in that way. So there's no threat. The simple fact is we all live on this terrestrial ball together. Most of us have more in common than we don't. And just one really quick thing, because I know time is getting short. When we look at this work, people of color, especially in Westchester, especially in circles of affluence, also hold privilege. Mm-hmm. So even myself, yes, I'm in the intersection of probably the worst outcome, Black and female, but I am educated, I am a citizen, I am an English speaker, I am a Christian, I identify as heterosexual. So I, even as a Black woman, can uphold systems of oppression because I have privilege. So when we start looking at it with the interracial coalition, and we start looking at how we gatekeep, how we power hoard, and how we money hoard at the local level, yeah, we need transparency on those zoning boards and planning boards. Who's sitting up there? What do they think about when they see someone like me? So I just wanted to go back to the global majority.
Yeah.
And my thing is transparency and access locally to try to figure out how do we get 12,000 units of affordable housing. And the reason I brought up the federal formulas is because of what you mentioned. Yeah, there's workforce housing, but some of the formulas go as high as $130,000 for an individual. So even if I'm an educated Black woman who's a teacher and I'm making $150, but I have 2 children, I might not be able to pay $2,500 a month for rent for a 1-bedroom, which is in the guidelines. So we got to look at the laws at the federal, state, county, and local levels, and not be so in love with our representatives that we don't challenge them and we don't look at their record. Where are the budget lines for the things that we care about? So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Michael, you mentioned really briefly on our talk, and I wanted you to bring it up, the end of the book, she talks about the truth. I keep messing up the whole name, but
Truth,
thank you, and thank you.
transformation.
A lot of T's and stuff. So please talk about it. And you also mentioned that you did some apartheid work. I don't know anything about anti-apartheid. Well, yes, anti-apartheid work. I don't know anything about that, and I want to
be clear.
Words do matter. So please go ahead before we lose.
Well, thank you. And we're going to have time for questions.
Yes,
right?
we are. We're going to take questions.
So I'll try not to take too much time. So yes, I was very fortunate to be able to do anti-apartheid work in the 70s and 80s. I think apartheid, people might be familiar with it now as it's being associated with the state of Israel. Some younger folks might not remember when South Africa was an apartheid nation. And there was a global effort in order to empower Black people, Black Africans, and colored Africans, people are called colored in South Africa, to get out from under the yoke of apartheid. And fortunately, that happened with a lot of international support. Again, the sum of us, right? When there's solidarity and the sum of us get together, there's some positive things that can happen. And the end of apartheid was a real positive thing. Mm-hmm. And that took place in 1994, and they set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission shortly thereafter under a government that was, I think they called it a united government, where the apartheid party, the Nationalist Party, actually was still part of the government when Nelson Mandela came out and won an election. And they created this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was very impactful. It had a lot of positive things about it. And so when Heather McGhee brought up this idea, or I shouldn't say it's an idea, the actions being taken around the truth, racial healing and transformation, I was really taken by it because they dropped the concept of truth and reconciliation for purposes of representing, I believe, the history of the United States better. I really appreciated that part of the book, and I would really suggest people look at it. So in terms of New Rochelle, because I'm really focused on New Rochelle, I think it would be a very important thing for New Rochelle to consider, especially because we have a shared history with South Africa in this area, right? The Dutch colonized South Africa very early on in the 1650s, let's say. My dates might be a little wrong. And then they were followed shortly by Huguenots, the Huguenots who were kicked out of France. So I'm from New Rochelle. The Huguenots settled New Rochelle. We're very proud of that fact that the Huguenots settled New Rochelle. And on their way here, they stopped by in the Caribbean to pick up some enslaved people to, do the work for them in New Rochelle. So the Huguenots followed the Dutch to South Africa. The Huguenots followed the Dutch to, I don't say they followed each other, but historically they came a little bit there after them. And the truth and reconciliation in South Africa in particular, the reconciliation piece was that, as Tasha said, Black folks have been in Africa for, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and the colonizers came. So there was something to reconcile with white South Africans. Well, here were all of us, well, Black folks in this country are stolen people on stolen land, right? I'm residing on stolen land. So the reconciliation is different, right? It's healing that needs to happen. And a transformation comes from healing. And I'm of the opinion that we're in a transformative period of time. If you don't see it, you're not really paying attention. And this is that makes me very hopeful that we'll be able to come out of the pandemic. We'll be able to come out of all the strife that's being exhibited in the world. And we'll be able to address honestly, openly, issues around race and heal both myself and as a community at large, and then transform our communities to be really what we can be. So that's kind of what I was thinking about.
That's a beautiful note to kind of end this on. What, let me just see what time it is before it's 3:33. We're going to take, I just want to, thank you, all of you really, for all of your thoughts on this. And I feel like we need another 4 hours. I could do it. I could sit here for another 4 hours, but I want to end the one on Heather McGee's words from the Sum of Us. She writes, "We're a nation riven with anxiety about who belongs. Many in power have made it their overarching goal to sow distrust about the goodness of the other. They're holding on white-knuckled to a tiny idea of we the people, denying the beauty of what we're becoming. They're warning that demographic changes are the unmaking of America. What I've seen on my journey is that they're the fulfillment of America. What they say is a threat is in fact our country's salvation. For when a nation founded on a belief in racial hierarchy truly rejects that belief, then and only then will we have discovered a new world." So I think it's appropriate to end on her words. And just to sort of, reiterate that understanding this and being part of this racial reckoning in this moment in time, which I think is like another extension of the civil rights movement, is really about knowing history. It's about listening to voices that we don't normally listen to. It's about looking at policy and connecting all of those dots because they all matter and they all play out. So we're going to open it up to audience. Are there questions? Yeah.
I want to let the folks at home know that they can hit the raise.
Oh, yeah. You can raise your hand out there virtually. I keep forgetting there's virtual audience. Hi. You can raise your hand and we'll ask your question for you, right? Or you can actually talk into the room. So if you raise your hand, you'll speak into the room. And is there anyone here who wants to? I know Shane does.
Okay.
You don't have to.
I'll stand up anyway. So, you guys know the adage, you track what you care about. Slavery was an economic institution. So in many ways, building Black wealth is an act of activism in and of itself. With those things being true, what are your conversion rates? Because white people aren't all bad. So we don't need all of them to overcome very overt racism. But what are your conversion rates on the ones who are overtly racist? What are your conversion rate on getting those corporations that could work with us and their communities? What's your turnover on budgets that you've appropriated from causes that used to lock us out? What are the numbers? Because you talked about a lot of the programs that you guys have going on, but what are the numbers?
Anybody want to take that?
I don't have numbers, honestly. That's not the role that I play in the community, in the work that I do. I'm more on a my approach is more on a one-on-one relationship building kind of thing. And I think there are those who are out there whose work is to do what you're asking. For me, I am more interested, or my focus is really on conversations, one at a time, with individuals from every spectrum across the board, from those who have not been heard to those who are parts of institutions and houses of worship. And literally what I do is go around having conversations, like literally just building relationships. I don't have the stats and the data on what you're asking, though, honestly.
I could try take a stab. So locally in Greenberg, through our housing initiative, there is a resolution that there's an opportunity for developers to have a set aside of 10% affordable housing, which is grossly under that's not enough. However, Greenberg is better than some other places. Let me say that about affordable housing. I think we currently have around 789 units of affordable housing. And when you look at the need for, I'm just gonna say 11,000 because I already did the math.
Right.
So when you look at 11,000, then Greenberg has to have 1,100, right? Because by population, we have 10% of the county's population. So that's a real number we could strive for. We could strive to increase it from 782 to say 1,100 if the county needs 11,000. And each municipality should really look at it that way. You know, what do we need to sustain our own economy? Back to that. This is everybody benefits if we do this. So how many units does my local municipality need? And kind of work from there. Another stat I could bring up is the wealth gap between white households and Black households. And I haven't looked at the data for Latinx households or AAPI households or Native American households. But in this instance, I think about 84% of the wealth in the country is held by white households. And their percentage is disparate. I'll get the numbers as someone else talks. I'll look up the stats. But for the Black households, they hold about 4% of wealth and are 13%. So that's just to give an idea of the wealth gaps. And this does include for the wealth in Black America, because let's not deny that there are some incredibly wealthy Black Americans in this country, and they're in there. And it's still very disparate. Still 6.9. And I'm sorry, Reverend can probably speak to this way better than I when it comes to wealth gap statistics. So if we look at how can we create equity in our own little places for housing, that affordable housing set aside needs to first be mandatory, not a choice. And it needs to increase to probably like 20% for us to really meet that number. And that's a matter of advocating for your local governments. Again, transparency on how to get on the zoning and planning boards. So those are some stats that I could try to help with. And it goes on and on across every area: economics, education, how even we're selling property. Because Black property owners are not getting their full worth when they sell, and getting inflated prices when they buy. So I don't know pick a stat, you know? It all shows disparity, and it all shows that we're going to have to disrupt these systems and be led by the people that are closest to the pain to help inform us of how to move forward to create equity.
I could answer as well, but Reverend, maybe you want to say something?
I appreciate the question. I mean, my answer is really just that, as I mentioned, the Poor People's Campaign is really aiming to influence policy making, both at the federal level and at the local, state and local level. I mean, I could give you a list of the demands. I guess I could try to like really quickly, like a living wage, equal pay for equal work, fully funded social welfare programs, and like in-kind assistance, including like SNAP and CHIP and HEAP, equity in education, expansion of Medicaid, fully funded public resources and access to mental health, expansion of public housing, expansion of infrastructure, freedom from debt. That's a big one. And then like other ways of addressing like wealth inequality. But I mean, the Poor People Camp, like, that's why I say this is a moral movement, because the Poor People really aims to shine a spotlight on all of these crazy inequities and injustices in our economic life and our life together. And again, the solution is to be a social movement, lifting up the voices of poor and marginalized communities. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but that's what I'm standing on, you know, in terms of my work with the Poor People's Campaign.
Shane, no, I don't think this will address it as fully as you would hope or want or like, but as you know, New Rochelle Against Racism, I'll back up a second. New Rochelle in 2015 rezoned the downtown to allow for really massive development. Anybody who's driven or through New Rochelle or by New Rochelle over the last 6 or 7 years see there's cranes up in the downtown. And New Rochelle Against Racism began advocating and organizing for good jobs, union jobs, more affordable housing, more money for schools, green space, money for youth programming, you know, a kind of a list, a similar list, which everyone kind of should know what that list is of how we can improve everybody's lives. And so we advocated for those things, and it ended up in something called an economic opportunity non-discrimination policy that the city of New Rochelle passed. And it set goals, aspirational goals, which are really good goals. Unfortunately, there are no teeth. Right. There are no mandates in it. So we've been struggling with the city and the developer since then to make these mandates. So the goals are 20% of the construction work in the downtown part of New Rochelle is supposed to go to New Rochelle residents. For every 20,000 hours of labor on a construction project, 1,000 hours is supposed to go to a new apprentice. And what that does is that allows New Rochelle residents to get into union apprenticeships to be able to make a decent living, accumulate some wealth, stay in New Rochelle, and send their kids to school, whatever their choices are in life. The city was, we worked with the city to see how their numbers were. Let's put it like that. They hired a compliance firm to see how they're doing on the 20% hours. Also, there's an MWBE component to it, so-called Minority Women Business Enterprise goals, pretty good goals of who's going to be actually hired in terms of the companies doing the work. So you have the workers doing the work and the companies paying the workers to do the work. Really high goals. So when the city did their first study to see how they're doing on this, terribly. I mean, every city council person was taken aback by how poorly their policy was, how it was ineffective. Something like 3% of the local jobs instead of 20%, et cetera, et cetera. So New Rochelle Alliance for Justice, as you know, has been working with faith leaders, Black faith leaders, New Roar in particular, and the Westchester building trades, the unionized building trades, in order to advocate for the unions to get the work. And if the unions get the work, they've agreed to take in New Rochelle members to meet the goals of this economic opportunity non-discrimination policy. So I don't have the numbers, but there was a class that went through. They are working. They're making a decent living as apprentices, and hopefully they'll be able to live decent lives. Now, this is juxtaposed with the city's weak policy, which is allowing for people to be hired at what I call poverty wages. They're a little bit above the minimum wage in New York And for us now, it's $15 an hour. And so most of the people who are going through the city's hiring hall, let's call it, are being paid, in my view, well, they are being paid poverty wages. If you want to, if you want to measure it out, they are poverty wages. So what we're advocating for is actually union jobs where people be able to make a decent living, MWBEs being mandated so that you and others are being allowed to get get the work to be able to build the economy. I don't know if that was,
yeah, please.
I just want to add that the reason why we're having such a hard time, Shane, is because these stats are not kept in our municipalities, right? So, we can't imagine that. So that's why the elected officials are shocked, because we're not in the practice of collecting this data. So we're really at a transformational time with maps being redrawn locally, right? So the state maps and the congressional maps are done, but we still have to do our county and municipal maps. So this is a time where we can really get involved and see how we can influence our decision makers to start putting money, right, behind research and data on racial, impact and outcomes based on race and income in Westchester.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Strickland. I'm not gonna speak for too long, hopefully, but no. I was born and raised in Mount Vernon, New York. My mother died in Mount Vernon Hospital, and she was a teacher for 21 years for the school district. I work at Westchester Medical Center in the breast surgery department, and I'm proud because I'm putting on for my family. My aunt was diagnosed in 2004 with breast cancer, and I am a student at SUNY Purchase College. My major is legal studies. And I'm kind of shaking, I don't know why. But I want to get involved. I don't want to start crying. I see a lot of youth that are struggling with the arts. Our voice needs to be heard. I am a resident at Tucker Hole Affordable Housing. I fought so hard. And my mother, I know she's proud of me. I know my father is proud of me. I want to put on for my city. I'm a part of Rochelle. The gym, Planet Fitness. I love it there. It's my home. I was a Mount Vernon Knight. I played volleyball from 8th grade to 12th grade. I was a Girl Scout at Grace Baptist Church. And I was born and raised at Mount Vernon Church of Christ. And my sister, she draws. We just had a Black ambition. But what I want to say to you is we have to stay connected. Don't be afraid. Ask questions. And I know you guys can hear me, the youth. Let's stay connected. And to Theresa and everyone else, I'm here. And I just want to say, how can we stay connected? Because as Black people, we don't stick together. We have to. And we love white people. We love you guys, genuinely. I come from a foundation where we love one another. My dad grew up with Earth, Wind, and Fire. He tatted it on his arm. My sister, she's the Earth, she's a Taurus. I'm the Fire, I'm a Sagittarius, and my brother's the Wind. And I just come to you guys humbly, asking to please stay connected with us. And whatever I could do, I'm here. Thank you.
First of all, thank you all for giving up your sunny afternoon also. It was, it's an important discussion. I loved hearing your stories and the contribution you're making. And Nicole, I love that passage you read. When I read chapter 10, what struck me was how the uplifting of minorities and immigrants in Lewiston benefited all of Lewiston and much of Maine. So, and I think economists would support that also, that the uplifting of minorities and immigrants benefits everybody. So that message doesn't get out. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. It's 1 + 1 is 3. So what ways is our community organizations here getting that message out? And what ways might we be able to get that message out better, that indeed we all will benefit from the uplifting of each other?
Great question.
Well, I'll say for us in Mamaroneck, I think this has really been an opportunity for us to sort of come to that realization that we've, like for Washingtonville, I think I've been there 8 years, and it's been our goal sort of to maintain our 40 units. And then we're trying to build some additional units, and we're trying to give some supportive services to sort of amplify the maximum benefits of what we do. And then when COVID came, the opportunity, like I said, there were some gifts that were there. Like, so the gift was, oh my God, maybe we should really be working more with other community organizations. Maybe we need to be partnering with our houses of worship. Maybe all of these concerned individuals that sort of came out in full force, how do we collectively now really move forward so that we really move the dial forward? And I think that's what's been the realization for us. And that's where we're sort of reshifting now as things start to open up. What kind of activities and programs and what kind of steps should we be taking for a coalition for affordable housing? How are we sort of strategizing collectively to do that? So what happened in Lewistown was it was sort of a really vacant, desolate sort of town. That's not the reality here. But the beauty is there's already the resources here. So how do we have the conversations where we make everybody feel comfortable that it's not that if you give more to those who need, you're going to lose. It's just going to be more of a, we're all going to win together, you know? People spend thousands of dollars yearly to go on vacation and experience other cultures. Oh, we could do that right here in our community. Like, just let's all be inclusive, and we'll have like the United Nations in our own community providing the best for everybody. Those who have more will help those who need more, but everybody is equally talented and has the potential. So how do we sort of just lift each other up in the most beneficial, loving, supportive kind of way? I think that's what the beauty of Mamaroneck and Larchmont sort of have. They have all the gems already there. So how do we just sort of shine them up, polish them up and shine them? And again, those who may not be of that mindset and they're there, this is not a conversation for you. And we're not really trying to address you. Just so sit off to the side and we're going to do what we do. I don't know.
I want to address it too. I think, Shane and I are friends, and he'll be like, you're in the business of converting people. That's what you do. And I'm like, I'm trying. But I think that, in the almost 4 years Kira's been here, we haven't converted people as much as we've found like-minded people who are not working together. Right. And it's like, oh, you're over there in Harrison, 5 minutes away, and you're thinking the way I'm thinking. Come on over here, so, and it's also a narrative shift. We have the same story. We hear it out in every administration, Democrat or Republican, we see it on TV, it's the same us and them thing, generation after generation. And I think it's what you're doing. You're here, you're learning, you're developing a new vocabulary. The next person you have dinner with who might not know about redlining or might not know about whatever, you can have that conversation and continue to call each other in. And it seems like a slow process, but look, we're also in the age of social media. I think they're just, to this young woman's point, like really staying connected. I think we feel that even more after COVID. We need that even more. And I mean, as I love these events. And often I want our organization to just do more of that, to bring people together, not just to have these conversations, but to really listen to each other, to work together. And so, I wouldn't think of it on like a America level. I think of it on what town do you live in, who's around you, who's thinking like you, where can you plug in to an affordable housing coalition, to CURE, to the Poor People's Campaign, so I think sometimes just like right in front of you, there's something that you can tap into that feels really fulfilling. But I don't want to take up, do we have more? Yeah, we have time for one more, okay.
Hi, I'm thinking immediately of a friend of ours from New Aurora, Bree Jones, who has Parity in Baltimore, and she is really doing something spectacular with housing and poverty and housing and wealth. So I'm thinking, and I'm a little bit more anxious because my children are they're adults, and 2 of the 4 are one is a homeowner. So what are we doing about Johnny Mae and Suni Mae home loans? What are we doing about that? Because some folks at the end of the day are going to spend more money in rent than some folks are spending in their mortgage. So we're talking about, the Poor People's Campaign, and I hear you, and I listen to WBAI, and I listen all the time, and I'm thinking, yeah. So what are we actually doing so that every year we don't have to have Black folks sit in front of someone and recertify and keep going through this trauma? What are we doing when we're talking about rent stabilization, like Stuyvesant Town 60 years ago? Their rent stayed the same, and they were able to pass that apartment down and build wealth. So it's not okay I make $5 more and then I have to pay $10 more in my rent. That's never going to eliminate poverty. That's only going to perpetuate the trauma. So what has been done, and what can we do to do something about that?
I'll jump in just for a second also to try to address what you raised. And, it comes down to power. And I think there are I call them forces of evil. The forces of evil don't want this to happen. Because when this happens, we are going to question this arrangement that we've all been living under for the last 400 years or however long we've been here. And, I can't go into this work without learning that, number one, and realizing it. And then how do we actually confront power? How do we get power for Black people in particular? Now, if I go in front of city council and talk like that, believe me, it's not, it's Michael going in front of city council and yeah, okay, look, thank you very much. But if I have 20 of you, particularly white people, particularly white men, get up and say, you know what? I'm with him or her or whomever, right? Following leadership of color. I'm with them, and I expect you to, do these things. And that can really have an impact on a local level to what you were talking about. We really can impact the local level, each person. And so I would encourage, you got to take the blinders off this. It's here for a reason. And when you confront it, you get smacked around. Speaking for myself, I get smacked around, so, you have to have a support group. I mentioned it at the very beginning. My neighborhood association started me out doing it. Now I have New Aurora and others. And you can't go into it thinking like, oh, yeah, this is the right thing to do. And why isn't it like this? It's for a reason, right? So, people have to organize. People have to speak out. People have to follow Black leadership. And believe me, I'll speak in New Rochelle. The leadership in New Rochelle, they know what needs to get done. Whether they have the political will to do it, that's what it comes down to. So if the more of us who are, speaking to them, like we're talking here today, they'll know we have to make room for them to do what's right. And they will do what's right. Even the developers, they know what to do. They're not made to do it. So therefore, why should they do it? To Shane's point, it's about money, right? It's going to cost money to somebody. I mean, that's the bottom line. So how do we make it so, the few that it costs a little bit of money to are willing to share that little bit of extra with everybody else? Yeah.
What? Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you, to your point too, Attilia, I'm always curious as to, now that I know the history of redlining, which I learned at 45 years old. I'm 50. I should have learned that in 8th grade. But I don't understand why we're not demanding the federal government rebuild Black wealth in home ownership. And I'm not even talking about rent stabilized or affordable housing. I'm talking about why did you, it's on, and I don't know what Build Back Better is or what's in that bill. I haven't looked at it. Tasha, you probably know what's in there, but that's not in there. Right. So, I just don't understand why, like that's a campaign in and of itself that Black and white people can get behind together, and all, people of color, to say, look, you blatantly, federal government didn't allow generational wealth and home ownership. So what are you going to do about it? And so that's a question. Is that a movement? Is that, or is it, is that something that can happen? And I don't know, these things seem large and overwhelming, but there are movements happening locally everywhere, right? Joya, you're part of one, and it does start locally. So, I don't know.
I really like that, actually, because it is something we can all get behind. And yes, it has to happen at the federal level, but we can agitate our local municipalities to pass resolutions and to get them to buy in to this idea that we actually should do something assertively, with energy and funding to address this crisis where people are living outside, preferably, because in Westchester County, you don't see street homeless, but you do have to go into a shelter system, which is very unpleasant to get a voucher. So you have to leave your shelter that you're losing to go into your shelter, like your domicile, your home, to go into a shelter that is not desirable, to then get whatever assistance. Like that, even in and of itself, is very dehumanizing. So yes, and state, county, local.
We're going over. I'm getting the. Does anyone want to end? Reverend Joya, I feel like you're up there on the screen and we kind of had our backs to you. I'm so sorry, but do you have any last comments? Anybody last comments? I don't want to leave anything unsaid.
Sure, maybe I can try to leave us on a hopeful note, and just, this book is very powerful, lifting up this tragic historical American truth that racism and white supremacy has been a very divisive, if not the most divisive force in our life together. But there have also been, throughout our history, instances of people coming together around their common humanity, around their common goals, around their shared commitments and beliefs, and rising up and demanding better. The civil rights movement is one great example of that, but there are countless others. And I would echo, what Michael and others have said: organize, organize, organize. Find people that share your beliefs, connect with organizations that are committed to the issues that you're committed to, and we can change things. We have to believe that.
So much, everyone, for being here. Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Reverend Joya.
Thank you.